Handcuffed and humiliated, a frail elderly woman is dragged into court, accused of what? Officer Grady thinks he's got an easy target. He's wrong. This is the story of Margaret Peterson, and the day a cop learned a powerful lesson about judging a book by its cover. A hushed courtroom buzzed with uneasy whispers as a frail elderly woman with a worn face and determined eyes stepped forward. Shackled at the wrists, she wore a simple dress and a weathered cardigan, her hair neatly pinned back. Across the aisle, the arresting officer, a young man with a cocky smirk, leaned back in his chair, certain he was about to witness her defeat. But the moment the judge glanced at the paperwork in front of her, the officer's smug expression faltered. Confusion flashed across his face, followed swiftly by a dawning sense of dread. The hum of whispers faded, replaced by a charged silence that gripped the room. Everyone was on edge, wondering who this woman truly was, and why the judge now regarded her with such astonishment. Earlier that day, Margaret Peterson, in her early 70s, had begun her morning in a modest apartment nestled in the heart of a quiet, aging neighborhood, the kind of place where most residents had lived for decades, where people nodded politely in passing but rarely stopped to talk. Margaret carried herself with an air of quiet resilience. Her gnarled hands spoke of a lifetime of work, yet her posture was straight, her movements deliberate. She rose before dawn, preparing for an early meeting at the courthouse, a place she seldom visited but regarded with reverence. As the sun climbed over the horizon, she left her small home, clutching a sturdy canvas bag filled with documents. The streets were still safe for the occasional jogger or dog walker. On her way to the bus stop, she noticed a young mother struggling with a stroller and a bag of groceries. Without hesitation, Margaret approached, setting her bag down. "Let me help you, dear," she said in a voice softened by years, but still firm. The mother hesitated before nodding gratefully. Margaret hoisted the bag with surprising strength and placed it securely in the stroller basket. "Thank you so much," the young woman murmured, her eyes glistening. Margaret simply nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips, as she retrieved her own belongings and continued toward the bus stop. A police cruiser passed her as she approached the corner. Margaret barely noticed, focused on making her bus. The cruiser, however, slowed to a crawl. Inside, a young officer with sharp features and a suspicious gaze fixed his eyes on her. Margaret glanced his way briefly, then adjusted the strap of her bag and quickened her pace. Something about his gaze unsettled her, though she had no reason to fear. She'd done nothing wrong. The cruiser pulled to a stop a few yards ahead of her, and the officer stepped out, hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Ma'am, can I speak with you for a moment?" he called, his voice carrying an edge that made Margaret's stomach tighten. She stopped and turned, clutching her bag a little tighter. "Of course, officer," she replied, her tone calm but wary. He approached, his boots crunching against the pavement. "May I see some identification?" he asked. Margaret frowned slightly but reached into her bag, producing her wallet and handing over her ID. The officer examined it briefly, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing out here this early?" he pressed. "I'm heading to the courthouse," Margaret explained. "I have an important appointment." The officer's eyes narrowed. "What's in the bag?" Margaret hesitated, puzzled by the question. "Just documents," she answered. "Mind if I take a look?" Without waiting for her consent, he reached for the bag. Margaret instinctively pulled back, her heart racing. "There's no need for that," she said firmly. The officer's demeanor shifted, his face hardening. "Step aside, ma'am," he ordered, his voice sharp. Margaret's pulse quickened, but she refused to let fear show on her face. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said evenly. "That remains to be seen," he retorted, already reaching for his cuffs. The surreal nature of the moment left Margaret momentarily paralyzed. Before she could fully process what was happening, she found herself pressed against the cruiser, Her arms twisted behind her back as cold metal closed around her wrists. A small crowd gathered, their murmurs a mix of shock and unease. Margaret bit back her outrage, drawing on years of discipline and composure. She knew protesting would only escalate the situation. Instead, she focused on breathing steadily, though humiliation burned through her like fire. As the officer placed her in the back seat of the cruiser, she caught a glimpse of the young mother she had helped earlier. The woman stood frozen on the sidewalk, her hands covering her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. At the station, Margaret was processed with a detached efficiency that bordered on cruelty. Her belongings were emptied onto a desk, her documents scattered without care. The officer's smirk returned as he rattled off accusations: suspicious behavior, loitering, potential theft. Each charge was more absurd than the last. Margaret's attempts to explain her situation were met with dismissive scoffs. "Save it for the judge," the officer sneered, tossing her belongings into a plastic bin. Hours passed. Margaret sat on a cold bench, her wrists aching from the cuffs. Officers exchanged glances, whispering and occasionally laughing. She caught fragments of their conversation. What could she possibly be up to at her age? One of them chuckled. Another speculated about her bag, joking that it might contain stolen goods. Margaret's anger simmered beneath the surface, but she forced herself to remain still. She had no intention of giving them the satisfaction of seeing her break. By the time she was informed of her court appearance the following morning, Margaret was both physically and emotionally drained. She spent the night in a holding cell, her thoughts a tumultuous mix of disbelief, anger, and resolve. She had been through worse in her life, she reminded herself. This too would pass. She just needed to endure a little longer. The morning brought no reprieve. Shackled once more, Margaret was led into the courthouse, her steps slow but steady. The courtroom was already filling with people, many of whom recognized her immediately. Whispers rippled through the room as she was escorted to the front. The officer from the previous day stood nearby, his smirk firmly in place. Margaret met his gaze briefly, her expression unreadable. The judge entered, calling the court to order. The officer's confidence seemed unshaken as he presented his version of events, painting Margaret as a suspicious and defiant individual who had resisted lawful commands. But as the judge turned her attention to the documents Margaret had brought, her expression shifted. "Miss Peterson," the judge said slowly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You are." She paused, glancing at the officer, whose smirk had begun to falter. "The lead advisor to the city's Housing Rights Council?" The courtroom erupted into stunned whispers. Margaret stood a little taller, the weight of the previous day's humiliation momentarily lifting. The officer's face turned an alarming shade of pale as the judge continued. "And you were on your way here to present evidence in support of your latest initiative, were you not?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Margaret replied, her voice steady. The officer stammered, his bravado crumbling. I didn't know who she was," he muttered, his eyes darting around the room. The judge's gaze was icy. "It is not your job to determine a person's worth based on appearances," she said sharply. Turning to the court, she outlined the events as Margaret had documented them. Witnesses corroborated her account, and security footage confirmed her compliance during the arrest. By the time the judge finished, the officer looked as though he wished the ground would swallow him whole. The judge ordered an immediate inquiry into his conduct, making it clear that his actions were unacceptable. Margaret's cuffs were removed, and she was handed her belongings. A murmur of approval swept through the courtroom as she stood, her dignity fully restored. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Some were reporters, eager to capture the story. Others were members of the community, outraged by the injustice Margaret had endured. She paused on the steps, the morning sun warming her face. She could have spoken out, called for retribution, or basked in the vindication of her name. Instead, she offered a calm, resolute statement. "This is not just about me," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "This is about the countless others who face similar treatment every day without the chance to fight back. Let this serve as a reminder that we must hold those in power accountable for their actions." The crowd's murmurs grew into applause. Margaret descended the steps with quiet determination, her mind already turning to the work ahead. This incident, while deeply personal, had only strengthened her resolve to fight for justice and equality. She had faced humiliation and prejudice, but emerged stronger, a testament to the power of resilience and integrity. Thank you so much for watching and supporting Story Karma. Your engagement, whether it's watching, liking, commenting, or sharing, helps us continue bringing you powerful stories of crime, justice, and karma. We truly appreciate each and every one of you for being part of this journey. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Your support keeps this channel going, and we can't wait to share more incredible stories with you.